If you're having trouble getting perfect rectangles in crochet, it's probably one of three problems. The first problem is that your starting chains could be way too tight, and that will result in your rectangle fanning out like this, where the base is sucked in, but the top stitches are much wider. So take a look at this. I made these chains with a 5mm hook, and all the stitches on top are all in the 5mm hook. But when I went and took my ruler and measured my chain width, the chains were about 6mm wide, and even using really tight tension for my bottom row of double crochet, the tightest I could get those stitches was 8mm. Now on the later rows, I used loose tension, maybe a little extra loose just to demonstrate, and these stitches at the top here are about 1.5 centimeters wide, so that's almost twice the width of the starting chains. So in crochet, a starting chain or any chain will always be more narrow than the stitches you place on top of it. So the solution is super easy. Just size up your hook. I size up my hook by 2mm. So if my project will be a 6mm hook, I will use my 8mm hook to make the starting chain. I just want to show you how much bigger you can go with your hook sizes. But that might not even be enough. So let me show you what I did yesterday. Yesterday I was trying out this very cool ripple stitch, and I did use my size 8 hook to make my starting chain because I was using my 6mm hook to make the normal stitches. But see how wide these puff stitches are? They are much wider than a normal stitch. So I was physically having to use my fingers to pry the chain open to be able to work into it because the tension was so tight. And I probably should have used a 10mm hook for this starting chain. So just to show you the difference in sizes, sometimes it really pays to significantly size up your hook for the starting chain. And the other example we have on this piece here is a difference in tension. The bottom row of double crochet has very tight tension, the top row has very loose tension. If you are, working back and forth and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm holding my yarn so loose, and then suddenly you tighten your tension way back up, that will create this uneven rippling edge and it will never look right. There's no way to fix tension without undoing the rows and redoing them. And this is one solution that is not an easy fix. If you are having uneven tension, you just have to spend the time and retrain yourself to do it correctly. Maybe doing granny squares or smaller projects where you just focus and try to get it right and then take a break and then make another one. Alternatively, maybe your rectangles look a little bit more like this, like a pyramid or stepping stones, or you realize you started with like 10 stitches and all of a sudden you have 5. You are just dropping stitches at the ends of rows. This is actually really easy to do and you shouldn't beat yourself up about it. I do it constantly, all the time, unless I use stitch markers. So let me show you how that happens. So this right here is a rectangle without any drop stitches at all. But what happens when we hold this fabric in our hands and we're working with it and going back and forth, the edges can get smushed around. And so we can get to the end of the row and say, oh, that's it, we're done, that's the last stitch, not realizing that if the fabric was properly shaped, we could see that last stitch popping out to work into. And this can be really difficult to see, like if you are switching yarn textures, yarn colors, yarn materials, and hook sizes. Stitches can look very different if you're using a 1mm hook versus a 15 huge millimeter hook. Stitches look very, very different, and you can just miss it. And in addition, the sides of double crochet look like the top V that we look for to work into. So you can not only accidentally miss stitches, but we can work to the end and say, oh no, look, there's another V, that's the top of a stitch for me to work into. So the solution to fix this is very, very simple. I'll show you right now. For this project, let's just say that our turning chain does not count as a stitch. So let's chain 2 for the turning chain. If we can. All right. So this turning chain is not a stitch. We're not going to be working into it later on. So because the space below is not taken up by a stitch yet, let's place our first stitch right into that space. Because the turning chain is not a stitch, we're never going to work back into it. But we will eventually work back into the stitch we just made. When we make all our double crochet across, and then chain more, and then work all our way back, this will be the last stitch of the next row that we work into. But what happens if our fabric gets misshapen and we can't quite find the right V? Well, just go ahead and place your stitch marker into the top of the correct stitch that you know you will be working into later on. So then, as we work across our row, we can see, where do I place my last stitch? Well, right in the top of the turning chain below. In the top of the turning chain, yes, we are going to switch our example now. So what happens now that we know exactly where to place our final stitch of the row? What happens if our turning chain does count as a stitch? Have you ever been asking yourself, why does this matter? Why does every pattern say if the turning chain is or is not a stitch? Here's how it matters. Our turning chain will count as a stitch, so let's chain 3. Okay. See these chains right here? We know that when we work, all the way down, chain, and work all the way back, the final stitch of the next row will be in the top of this third chain right here. So go ahead and place your stitch marker into that chain specifically, carefully picking up the back bump. This is not the same as marking the chain space. So the chain space would just be, the space in between the chain and the stitch next to it. So marking an individual chain is not the same as marking a chain space. But now, because our turning chain does count as a stitch, we know that this stitch below is taken. Technically, there's already a stitch on top of it, right? So go ahead and place your first stitch into the next available space. So we have our turning chain, that's 1. We have our double crochet, that's 2. And now when we work back across, we have this exact chain marked where we know to work into it. And this way, if you want to watch your show and not have to focus too much on a simple blanket or scarf or anything like that, you can just work back and forth across really quickly and never have to spend all that time worrying at the edges of the project if you've picked up the correct stitch or not. But let's take a look at a couple more things that could be potentially going on for you. So here we have accidentally dropped stitches along the way, but another way that you can make a ripply and uneven edge is by making a mistake, just what we were talking about, by accidentally putting your first stitch next to the turning chain when you shouldn't, or accidentally skipping the first stitch. So if your project says, the turning chain is a stitch, and you put your stitch into the same space below, that is going to make a ripply, uneven edge. And if your project says the turning chain is not a stitch, and you keep skipping the first stitch, that's going to cause problems as well. So if you see a random bump or it just is not looking right, see if you're placing your first stitches of the row correctly. And in addition, if you accidentally make some turning chains longer, so maybe you're supposed to chain 2, and then every now and then you chain 3 on accident, because, to be honest, if you pull your chains too tightly, it can be kind of hard to count them. So if you add extra chains into turning chains, that can give you a bumpy edge as well. And as my tip for you, let's take a look at this rectangle here. Now, along the way, I have not dropped any stitches. Technically, this is a perfect rectangle as far as crochet is concerned. But take a look. That is still kind of a ripply edge. This is normal for crochet. You are never really going to get a perfectly straight edge unless you are working with special techniques, or maybe you're doing something just with single crochet. If you have ripply edges like this, that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. That's normal. You can sometimes block this out, so getting your project wet or steam treating it and pulling it out into its correct shape. But more often than not, to fix this ripply edge, you either have to add a border or do a special technique like stacked single crochets to replace turning chains or things like that. Okay, so these are my 3 tips for you to fix your rectangles. First one is increase the size of your chains. The second one is use stitch markers to mark the beginnings and the ends of your rows so that you always know the last place to put your last stitch. And the third one is just retraining yourself to use better tension, just in case you may be going like really big tension in some rows and then squishing it together on other rows.